Welcome to the QT Podcast. This show is where two LGBTQIA plus tech professionals, entrepreneurs, and leaders share insights, challenges, and successes because queer innovation deserves the mic. I'm your first co-host, Nofel Testani, CEO and co-founder of QueerTech.
And I'm your second co-host, Andy Saldana, COO and co-founder of QueerTech. In the fourth season of the QT podcast, we're sitting down with investors, funds, and founders who are reshaping what fundraising can look like for 2S LGBTQIA+ and equity-deserving entrepreneurs. This season is bringing you conversations from the Fundraising Spotlight series, an initiative brought to you by QueerTech's QT Founders Program. A huge thank you to our sponsors, the Canadian Queer Chamber of Commerce, the Innovation, Science and Economic Development of Canada, and TD for their commitment to driving innovation and inclusion within the queer tech ecosystem.
We'll dig into how to pitch with power, build real relationships with investors, navigate term sheets, and access capital that actually sees your lived experience as an advantage and not a liability. We'll also talk about the emotional side of fundraising, resilience, identity, and staying grounded while you build.
Whether you're raising your first round, planning your next one, or just curious about how money moves in tech, this season is your guide to navigating fundraising as a queer founder.
In today's episode, you'll hear our fundraising spotlight conversation with Tristan Smythe. Tristan is the managing director of Propel Impact Foundation and CEO of Propel Impact Capital, where they're helping train the next generation of impact investors. Across various leadership roles, Tristan has advised and directed over $2 billion in economic development initiatives.
Propel Impact is fundamentally changing the narrative around capital and who invests it. They're a national Canadian nonprofit running experiential learning programs focused on impact investment and social innovation. Exactly the kind of inclusive capital we champion here at QueerTech.
Hi, Tristan. Hello, friend. How's it going?
Hello. Good. Great to be here.
Yeah, welcome to this series.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to see you again. We'd love to learn a little bit more about you and hoping you could give us a little bit about your background, your story, how you arrived at the Propel Impact Fund.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've taken, I would say, a circuitous journey into investing. I now have a job that, at the start of my career, I never thought that I would. And what really drew me into investing is recognizing just the power of capital when it's in the hands of the right people, and into impact investing when you realize just how much positive good, both environmental and social, can be created through this. So I spent a lot of my career working with youth, and in particular working with young people around their workforce development. And I've also spent a lot of my career working on Indigenous economic development, and so getting to work and advise and direct on large major infrastructure projects around energy. But my passion is really around supporting entrepreneurs in their journeys. So with Propel, we started 9 years ago to answer one single question: can young people with the right support make intelligent, impactful investments in their local communities? Over the last 9 years, we've seen and made over 21 investments across the country through a program that brings together young people ages 18 to 30 to be in the driver's seat of the decision making. For every dollar we've invested, our portfolio has raised through subsequent funding rounds over $240 in subsequent funding. And so that speaks to the survivorship within the portfolio. It also speaks to the quality of the investment decisions that young people have been making. And so for us, what started as a question 9 years ago is the proof point of our investment thesis as an organization. And I think, really the success of this comes from the inclusive nature of the young people that we're bringing together, that our program is an opportunity for people of any background, any education, to participate, to learn, and get to invest. And so I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about our work and to talk about investing in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear a little bit about how your personal journey has, you talked a little bit about your early career and how that's brought you to Propel, the investment thesis overall, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how you bring yourself into that work on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the things that what drew me to Propel, I'd first been a mentor in our programs and then have later obviously joined as staff, was just seeing the incredible nature of young people in this country, whether they're Canadians, international students, everyone coming together and seeing that and really seeing Propel as something I wish that I had when I was, 18 years old as a learning opportunity. And also, as a queer person myself, you know, 15 years ago when I was, really starting out, you didn't see yourself in much of the workforce. It was something that we didn't really talk about. And so for me, coming into this work is being out and proud and being that model for other young people. And I think it's what we see then when we come into our investment decision making is that, our portfolio is, largely mirrors the demographics of our participants. Our alumni, 61% are women and gender nonconforming. 40 over 77% are BIPOC, and we see that mirrored in the demographics of who our founders are that we've invested in. And for us, I think so often when we talk about the inequitable flows of capital, what ends up happening is we're talking about kind of problems with entrepreneurs as if this is an entrepreneur's problem, how capital is actually moving, instead of recognizing that this is an investor's problem. And that's why we exist as an organization is it's, our view is not to train investors to be, in diversity, equity, inclusion and trying to change the old guard. Our view is bringing in the next generation who know how to do this better and equipping them through experiential learning to be able to do it better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
yeah, it's really great because, like, in the conversation that we have here, we really kind of look at three aspects, right? Like, we want to talk about your investment thesis and the
Yeah.
framework, and excited to kind of hear that. And especially, I hear a lot of support for equity deserving group to us LGBTQ and that intersectionality. So it'll be great to hear that from you. We'll also talk about the how do you measure performance, right, and the
Yeah.
impact also for these startups, and then look at the outlook for 2026 and beyond. Tell us more about the fund, and what is your investment thesis, and how does the fund deploy funds differently than conventional capital providers.
Over the last 9 years, we deployed out of what we call our demonstration fund, and it was really that proof point around that initial question. And so through that model, it was really our own testing and iteration to say, how do we, train youth better, that educational component, but also how do we understand the unique needs of entrepreneurs and other organizations across Canada, and recognizing that geography plays a critical role in how we think about investing within Canada. So that was sort of our history. Where we're at now, we're now raising our next fund that we call the Next Gen Impact Fund, and it's actually two separate investment vehicles within there. We have our venture fund where we're doing equity investments, and then our community credit fund that we're doing lending out of. Because one of the things that we learned over the last period is that there's a relationship between debt and equity. And for us, what we want to do and why we've created the fund in this way is that we're able to bring the right form of capital to the right opportunity. We're not pushing people into, oh, if we're an equity fund and what they really need is a term loan, or what they really need is accounts receivable financing, we're providing the wrong form. And so what we're able to do is invest across that continuum of capital needs, and then also recognizing how that relates to different, the needs of different organizations and different geographies. And so from our impact investment thesis, we're really focused on, because we're empowering young people to shape the world in which they're going to inherit, our four areas of impact are the future of society. And so thinking about how we create a better and more livable world in terms of social infrastructure, in terms of, inclusive employment and truth and reconciliation. We're focused on the future of what we call the future of industry. And so thinking about environment from more of that kind of standpoint, that yes, we want to address climate change, but the largest driver of climate change are industrial emissions. And so we're looking at, advanced materials, we're looking at decarbonization, we're looking at energy transitions. Our other two areas are the future of food. And so thinking about ag tech, agriculture, biodiversity. And then the last one is the future of health and well-being, and thinking about how we move in this country from what oftentimes feels like a sick care system to a healthcare system. And we develop those verticals in consultation with our alumni to talk to youth and young people and say, well, what matters to you? How are we actually changing and moving that dial as investors? And so that became our investment thesis.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's just a few small problems you're trying to solve there, huh?
Yeah, just a little bit, just a little bit.
No, that's awesome. You get to say you're changing the world every day that you go to work. That's phenomenal. That's such
Yeah,
an admirable mission moving
thank you.
forward. I'm going to go off script a little bit here, and I wanted to dig in a little bit to the part where you have two pathways to funding, like
Yeah,
two instruments.
yeah,
And I think it would be helpful for some of the founders in the audience or that are listening to this to understand kind of like how to evaluate which path they should go down. We hear a lot from founders is like, it's time for me to raise. I need to raise
yeah,
funds, and then the understanding of what that actually means is often uh, lost. And
yeah.
so it would be wonderful if you could answer, you know, how someone can evaluate which path is the right one.
Yeah. One of the things I like to say, and I think this is a challenge in Canada that Canadians have, that we have this idea that debt is bad. And debt is good. It's good in the right forms, in the right cases. And especially, it's also still good for early stage entrepreneurs. And so that was in part why, we created the Community Credit Fund, to understand, those different levers. And this was a conversation I was actually having earlier this week with an American investor that was saying, Americans, one of the differences is that they see debt in a different way that risk adverse Canadians are. And I think, for us, what we recognized is that, as a venture investor, we have certain financial performance expectations. For us, in truth, if something won't, in our, early estimate, 15x plus our investment, we're not going to do it. Like, that's our perspective as venture. Now, there's a lot of incredible businesses that don't create that kind of multiple on your initial investment. And I think it's a significant gap when we talk about funding for startups and entrepreneurs, is recognizing, well, what supports businesses that can't do that? What supports businesses that need that growth capital to 5x to 3x? And so that's where we see debt and credit solutions is incredibly important. And so I think for the entrepreneurs looking at this, I sit through a lot of calls where I say, like, yes, you need money. I think that's like a premise that a lot of investors understand, that an entrepreneur needs money. Money is necessary in order to reinvest into the business and grow, but that doesn't always have to be an equity investment. It can be, like I mentioned, term loans. It can be accounts receivable financing. It can be revolving credit. And I think for, entrepreneurs, when thinking about the capital that they might need, it's important to understand what you want to do with it, and also being realistic in terms of what growth that capital is going to unlock within your organization. And I think that's really the key to the wayfinding, is saying, what can I do with this money and how is that going to help my business? And then better understanding the different pathways. I think the unfortunate truth with debt is that so many times it comes with obligations around collateral and some of these other things that, in truth, and what we recognize as an investor is that there are intersections with, um, historical injustices around, not everyone has a house that you can collateralize. And that is in part due to, you know, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia that exists in the world, right? It's not about individuals. There's systemic problems around that. And so for us, we think about um, collateral, we think about lending in a little bit of a different way. And so I think, debt is necessary, but there's always going to be that challenge among other investors in how they think about risk and security.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I was wondering, this thesis is very different than most traditional capital firms, and I was wondering if you could give us an example of a time, a few examples of how this has empowered maybe underestimated or overlooked founders in a way that uh, that was super surprising or uh, moving towards the success metrics that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we found with our model by having youth in community, that kind of that boots on the ground, means that we see opportunities and deals far earlier than other investors. That we have, genuinely over 100 people across the country right now looking for investable opportunities. And what it means is that we're able to identify potential where they're at in their community. It means that for us, you don't have to come to Toronto for an event if you're living in Regina or if you're living in Newfoundland, etc. And so it's really critical on that side. What our program also allows us to do is to put a level of effort into due diligence and to really be thinking about opportunities a lot further. And also because of our educational nature, we're able to provide that capacity building support that a lot of times, and we've seen this, a little bit more to your question, Andy, we've seen opportunities come our way that are not investment ready. And because we have capacity building programs, because we have intern programs, we're actually able to do that help along the way. And so, an example, um, one of our recent investments is into an incredible company out of Kingston called Spectra Plasmonics. They have an incredible device that supports with drug detection, so able to do spectral imaging to identify fentanyl, carfentanil, and drugs. And so being able to sell that into harm reduction, social services, supporting policing in that way, and also saving lives from overdoses. And this was an opportunity that we saw several years ago, and it just wasn't ready yet. And so we've been able to maintain that relationship along the way, and so now have been able to invest. And I think for us, what we really think about, the critical question that we ask in our due diligence and when we're taking that initial call is this someone doing their life's work? And I think that to me is like the incredible and crucial question to always be asking and answering. And I think it's one for, the entrepreneurs on the call to ask themselves, am I doing my life's work? At the end of the day, can I say, this is kind of what I was put on the planet in order to do? And, the reason I bring that up is one of our other recent investments out of Vancouver is into a company called Flutter Care. They're a perinatal wearable monitoring device to support, childbirth health and monitoring the safety of, the fetus. And this was founded by, an incredible woman who is both a doula and an engineer. And she came up with the idea based off of her own experience as a doula, but also her lived experience with the challenges that her mother had faced with childbirth. And, that informed her story. And you know, I think she might be the only doula engineer in Canada. And it's like, that's someone
I think
who was put on this planet
yeah.
to save mothers, to save, parents, to save children and stop stillbirths. And like that for us was such an incredible and powerful story. And I think when we see that, it's magic.
I love that when you said that. Are you doing your life's work? It gave me goosebumps, and it's such a different perspective to bring to the table when assessing companies and validity. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, and one of the things as you were talking, Tristan, is like I look at the market right now. It's pretty brutal to raise money for founders, the least to say, right? And so, one of the things we try to help our founders is really thinking about, what are some of the biggest mistakes you're seeing founders are making in this climate? I mean, you mentioned earlier, you need to have the story right for the growth and stuff. But what are other mistakes that you're seeing them make?
One not mistake, but to your comment, Phil, like it is a bad market. And so I think the number one thing that founders should know is that it's not them. Like they're not alone in this. And I say
Yeah.
this as someone also raising a fund. It's hard to fundraise for investors right now, and it's
Yeah.
shared across. I think
Yeah.
a mistake. So, on that positive note, I think one of the mistakes I do see is every investor conversation you have is a temperature check on the market. It's customer discovery, it's market discovery. And so I think, it is important, as much as we want to say, the market isn't good, to actually like also receive that information. Like if you aren't having a good time in terms of fundraising, it's also good to take that as feedback and actually understand, like, is the pitch working? Is this the right product? Do we need to pivot? And especially for us as early stage investors, right? Like we're pre-seed. Sometimes we've gone in at like what feels more like a pre-seed, in that really early stage. We expect things to pivot. I think probably of our 21 investments, looking at the investment memos and where those companies are now, there's been changes. Like there's
Yeah,
been pretty interesting changes. So I think it's important as you're going through that fundraise to understand those market signals and actually be adaptive to that. One of the things I tell entrepreneurs is that they need to be, yes, doing their life's work, but
yeah,
they need to be obsessed with the problem, not necessarily the solution, right? Like you need to
yeah,
be interested in solving this issue and not just trying to sell the great idea that you've had. And I say that as someone who loves to come up with ideas myself, but why I'm a bad entrepreneur myself is that I'm not obsessed with problems. I just love coming up with ideas. And so I think that, in all honesty, is kind of like the biggest thing that I see is, are
yeah.
people understanding the problem that they're trying to solve? And is their solution the right solution for that?
Yeah, and we've seen also like the solution evolve or change, right? We've
Oh
seen
yeah.
companies a lot of times as they go to market pivot because
Yeah.
the solution that you thought again doesn't work. So I think having that flexibility and understanding the problem is really key. A lot of founders, one of the things we think about also is like what should they be preparing for, right? And you kind of allude to this a little bit earlier, but we think about sometimes I'm like, is it worth for you to go and finding customers and investing time to find customers than investors, right? And sometimes there is like figuring out what is the priority and how you do that. So what are some of the you know kind of levers you're thinking founders should be focused on as they prepare for their raise?
So I think the number one thing, and this has been a thesis of mine that I've been developing over the last while. It's also going to sound a little bit self interested to Propel, but I think the best way for a founder to prepare for fundraising is to go through an investor program. Like, understand how investors are going to pick apart your business. And it's always hard for us as individuals to edit our own work. It's hard for us to bring that mentality. And so, what I've seen with entrepreneurs who've gone through investor training to, there's various different programs across Canada that do this, but to build out that skill set to understand how behind closed doors after the pitch it's going to be, digested, dissected by the team. I think that's a really critical skill to develop to help you better understand your pitch, to understand your value proposition, and to understand what's going to be talked about after you're out of the room, to then know, okay, am I actually highlighting the right things? And I think that's, a really important part for entrepreneurs to understand when they're raising, is to know what's the green light signal from an investor, what's going to get them to say yes, and to make sure that in your pitch, and then when you move into due diligence, that you're highlighting those critical pieces that actually matter to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a question. Propel Impact Fund is very mission driven and values driven. The ventures that you're investing in and supporting are impact driven and very values forward. So as these companies start to grow towards success, how do you help founders kind of maintain that value centric piece to their business when profit is key to continuing forward and proving, investor success? So
Yeah. For us, we call ourselves an impact first investment fund. And so what we always are looking for is opportunities where impact is core and inextricable from the business operations. That as the impact grows, you then see growth in finances. And as the finances grow, that means that there's a corresponding growth in impact. And in truth, that isn't necessarily possible for every business, but an example I'll use: a few years ago, we invested in a company out of BC called Verity. They create smart irrigation valves and also have a software component. So it's a device plus software to support farmers and save on water, better distribute fertilizer. And so what it does is it saves water, improves crop yields, etc. And when we invested, they were incredibly tiny organization. I think it was a few thousand a month in revenue, in recurring revenue. And the investor update we just got is that in 2025, they helped farmers save 1 billion liters of water.
Wow.
And so when you see that kind of impact growth, it's inextricable. Every device they sell is saving farmers water. It's improving our food systems. It's improving food production. And we see that in health. We see that across a multitude of areas. And so I think, impact is maintained and never, at tension with financial returns when impact is core to the business operation. And so that's sort of the answer to that.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that example. I want to know all of these companies. I think they sound, they are changing the world. So it's really phenomenal to see a fund really focusing on that huge societal change that we're looking to have. Just again, it's just solving a few small problems.
Just a few.
When we look at what's coming in 2026, what would you say that founders should be focusing on building, and what should they maybe avoid?
Yeah. I think in terms of building, I will say I do have a positive outlook on 2026. I think from a fundraising standpoint, for entrepreneurs in venture in Canada. I mean, it is only January, so maybe check in mid-year. But I think at a broad level, one of the reasons why I'm actually, dare I say, excited for 2026 is that we're having some real conversations on a national level around the economy, around entrepreneurship. We're having conversations around buying in Canada. And for the first time in what feels like years to me, we're also talking about, like, what does it mean to invest in Canada? And what does the Canadian venture ecosystem look like separate from the United States? I think so often venture in Canada has grown and lived under the shadow of a much bigger economy to the south. And as anyone who's a gardener knows, plants don't grow well in shade. And we're now in a moment where the shade is still there. Like, we know it's there, but it's also a moment where, hey, the sun's shining on us a little bit more. And I think that's one of the big things for entrepreneurs to be thinking about is, like, the speech that Mark Carney just gave in Davos. Like, there's some really interesting signals at provincial levels, federal levels around how we're thinking about the Canadian economy. And so I encourage entrepreneurs to really be listening to that language. This is a government, not that this is the major purchaser for a lot of entrepreneurs, but the government is signaling specific changes, and we're seeing that kind of follow through. And so, the other constraint, though, for this is that it's a really interesting economy right now. Affordability is critical. And so, what I would say to anyone, in the early stages who's maybe thinking about being an entrepreneur is to ask yourself the question of, your problem and your solution, and whether it's B2B or B2C sort of solution. If budget cuts are coming, are you at the top of the budget cut list, or are you at the bottom of the budget cut list, right? Like, for individual, for us as consumers, is this my snack budget, or is this my, utility bill? And I think those are some of the things for entrepreneurs to be really thinking about, that their survivorship during, what looks like some interesting recession signals is going to be about whether, where you sit on that kind of, affordability ranking. And so I think that's the one thing I would be really focusing on. It's a thing that we're hearing a lot from, customers when we do our own market discovery as a part of our due diligence process, is that affordability is coming up at the top of nearly everyone's kind of list of priorities. And I think that's the big thing to be talking about as entrepreneurs, is how are you solving affordability problems?
I want to flip it also, like thinking about, BCs, right, and how they can contribute. I think we're now calling on, especially with the market and the uncertainty that exists out there, and like what kind of advice or that you would give some of the VCs as we're also looking to support our communities?
I mean, I think, for venture capital and other VCs, that's where a lot of our youth talent uh, go on to work. And so that's, always wonderful to see. But I think, one of the big things is, if I'm going to be a little bit critical now and some feedback is, what we see in Canada is not a lot of, in my view, conviction when it comes to investing, and courage. I think this is a moment for VCs to actually operate with courage and conviction to be the first ones willing to invest. Like, this is what I hear from a lot of our portfolio that's still fundraising or fundraising subsequent rounds, is it's a lot of like, well, when you hit this number, I'll invest. Or like, if they come in, we'll come in too. And so what you end up is this just like, you know, millions of dollars circling this chicken and egg situation that no one's willing to move first. And I think there always is a first mover advantage in terms of, your position, in terms of what you're doing. And I think this is a moment where more VCs need to say, hey, I actually believe this is a great opportunity. If so and so is in or not, we want to do this deal.
Yeah. More leadership, right, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And it is, right? I think this is really a market where we need to invest. Again, we talk about, buying Canada. The other part also I think about is like government, right?
Yeah.
Like also when I look at the outlook, in Quebec, the government have decided to focus on scale ups, right?
Yeah.
And so federal is focusing on defense, and so I think about the whole ecosystem, and I'm like, what role governments, either provincial or the federal, should play in strengthening the ecosystems across the country?
I think the number one thing that government needs to keep in mind, provincial and federal, and we're seeing a lot, and this is a good thing, talking about like growth capital, but
Yeah.
People need to remember that Series A comes after seed and pre-seed, and if we're seeing this kind of growth capital, like you need the if you want the investment opportunities at Series B, Series D, Series, etc., you need a lot more over here. And I think this is a challenge that we see with, some of the ways that government funding is moving, but in particular how, Canadian pension funds and larger institutional investors that understandably want, because of their obligations, lower risk investments, but they have to know that like you need people to come in and do the higher risk work. Otherwise we'll be starving ourselves of entrepreneurs and talent.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, without planting the seeds, we're not going to get the trees, right? And the trees that get the fruit.
Yeah.
So like, it's really important that we support that ecosystem.
It's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you, Tristan. I have a ton of questions, but I want to let the audience have the opportunity to ask some questions as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tristan, again for talking to us, and let's see. We'll see what our audience has to say.
Yeah, so that's going to move us to our audience Q&A portion.
Well, allow me to kick things off, Andy and Tristan. So the first question that we have pertains to how queer and trans founders specifically can take advantage of Tristan, you described your optimistic outlook for 2026. So what advice would you give queer and trans founders specifically on like what markets or affordability problems feel most unlocked by queer and trans lived experience right now?
It's a great.
Just a small question.
We'll just start it light.
Yeah. I think I spent, as a queer person, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about my own identity in my work, and I spent a lot of time with other queer founders. And I think, one of the things that of many identities that folks can have, queerness being 2SLGBTQI+, our gender identity is something that we can either choose to bring into our work or not and bring into our stories. And I think that I don't think either way is sort of, I'm not going to weigh in on one or the other in terms of, how you show up to work and how that plays into your fundraising story. And it's something that, I hear from queer entrepreneurs that they don't want to bring that up when they're fundraising because that's not actually a part of their business. And I think that, one of the great things right now is that there's still work to be done around combating homophobia and transphobia in the workplace and in the general world. But there's actually an opportunity now to not necessarily have that as a core part of, how you're fundraising and how you're thinking about yourselves as an entrepreneur. And, for me, I don't bring up being non-binary in every conversation because that's just not a part of my gender identity. So now to get to, the question, I think there's a lot of opportunities that if you think that that component is a part of your lived experience and is a part of your, as I was saying earlier, why are you put on this planet in terms of the problems or the solutions? I think it's really important to understand, the gaps that you're seeing as a queer or trans person and knowing and how that gives you unique insight into opportunities. A company I think that's really incredible, Purpose Med, they have their product Freddie that delivers PrEP to folks. And I've talked about that with straight folks and they're like, they don't understand the need there. And I think that to me is the thing, is understanding how your lived experience helps you uniquely understand the problem and helps you understand and bring forth a unique solution. And so that's what, I would say to folks. I think that can come in a whole variety of different, areas in terms of where you're thinking about, in terms of industries and others.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a question for you, Tristan. Like, what stage should founders think about reaching out to Impact Fund and you personally? Like, is it pre-seed, early stage, seed stage?
That's a great question. I'll give it, two thoughts. Just a general one around approaching investors in general. I think it's really important to start relationships when you don't necessarily need capital. And, something, I guess, to your earlier question now, Phil, around mistakes I see entrepreneurs make is jumping right into pitches. Like I've seen this repeatedly at conferences where it's just like, hi, hello. And then they start pitching instead of getting to know investors a little bit more, to have a little bit of a conversation, and I really encourage folks to ask questions like, oh, if someone says they're an investor, to talk about, oh, what are you excited about? Like, what's the most exciting deal you've seen? What's the most exciting company? To get a sense of, how that person thinks, to know and be able to assess yourself. Oh, am I going to actually be a fit with this person, with that fund's thesis, to like get to know them a little bit more, to then be able to do that assessment. And also, like, investors are taking a portion of your company. Do you really want to sell a portion of your company to that person? And so I think that kind of wayfinding, that relationship building. And so, when you're at events, just like talk and start to develop relationships when you don't necessarily need capital. So that way they've followed your business a little bit longer. Back to my earlier comment around Spectre, right? Like we followed Malcolm and his team for nearly 3 years before investing. So like really recognize that, it is a relationship building exercise and it doesn't necessarily need to start when you need capital. In terms of your question, Andy, I think it's, for us, the first thing I always think is like, could you bootstrap this farther? Like, we're one of those funds that I don't want to take ownership of your company if I don't actually think that you need to be selling it. I think some people like just think they can sell, and I'm like, no. If you can retain all of that value and you get to be you and your other co-founders, your team, if you get to be richer at the end, and that means that I missed out on it, I'm okay with that. And so I think that's the real question that I'm going to be asking myself is, do I think that this founder really needs the money? Or am I taking truly equity away from them when they could just bootstrap this further? And so that to me is kind of that stage to really, come and approach different investors, is when, yeah, you can't take it any further through other means.
What are some of the questions founders should be thinking about or asking investors in that kind of due diligence, getting to know them stage?
I think the biggest one is investors need you to be successful, right? Your success is their success. And so, as a part of that, the value that they bring is supposed to be not just capital at the beginning. In the VC world, we call that supporting or servicing. And that to me is one of the big things is, does this fund, this angel investor, this institutional investor, what kind of value do they bring in addition to their capital and long term? A lot of times that might be advisor seats, that might be board seats, but in truth, and this is maybe back to things that VCs need to think about, like a company only needs so many board members. If you have 20 investors and everyone's like, our value add is being on your board, you don't need a board of 20. And so I think it's really important for entrepreneurs to be asking that question of like, what value are they going to bring to the table long term?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of just to close our conversation, again, we talked about a very hard market. Fundraising is not, it's hard even in good condition market. And that really leads to like founders feeling burnout, right? And so people are mentally and physically exhausted from hearing no and navigating. What are some of the advice you have of, some of the founder listening now that maybe feel a little discouraged and burnt out from trying to raise money?
It's really interesting when we look at, some of the different aggregated data around, how hard is it to fundraise, et cetera. And like, this is something that I think you will probably hear a ratio of several dozen no's to a yes. You might even have a ratio of like 1 to 100. And so, in coming into this, like, you need to understand that this is not a high ratio success sort of work. And I think, a really important part of that is that, like, recognizing that it's hard and knowing that it's hard and that you're not alone, I think are critical parts of that burnout. And I think this is something that tenacity, plays well in this. And I think it's important to, be able to get creative around who you're reaching out to, where you're finding capital, who you're talking to. And so I think those are sort of I would say, like, it's not a solution for everyone when it comes to burnout, because burnout's real and it can be really challenging. But knowing that, I think, probably if you're to talk to any successful entrepreneur, if you're to talk about the people who founded unicorns,
Yeah.
I've talked to people who have founded successful companies. I've never heard a story where they're like, it was easy and stress-free the whole time. I think everyone experiences burnout and experiences long stretches of burnout. And
Yeah.
so I think that's, a part of the trade-off of being an entrepreneur is the mental difficulty that honestly comes with this.
Yeah. One advice also I tell a lot of founders is like, you don't have to do it alone. There is a community, like find community, find people in your city, someone that you can just sometimes call and just like yell on the phone and have that outlet, right? And then people who you can sit and have constructive conversation because they're going through the same thing. They might have figured something out that you haven't. And I think having that community feel makes you feel like you're not alone, just like trying to pound email and phone and get there. So really, really great. Thank you again, Tristan, for connecting with us, taking the time. But anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I loved what you just said now, Phil. And I think one thing I'd encourage the entrepreneurs is that other people raising aren't your competitors. That's an incredible opportunity to even share notes, right? Like, three of you might come and pitch us, like, go share your notes and be like, well, Tristan said this to me, or like, and pass it to people who are like actually build that kind of community amongst yourselves and recognize that, in that ratio, like I said, that you might get 100 no's. Like, if one of your colleagues gets a yes, that's great. And if they're able to give you enough information from one of their no's that you're able to have a yes when you talk to that investor, that's what the success looks like. And that's what community building looks like.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the QT Podcast, powered by the QT Fundraising Spotlight Series.
If you're a QueerTech founder, check the show notes for links to our QT Founder Program Propel impacts LinkedIn and other resources to support your fundraising journey.
Give the QT Podcast a quick rating and subscribe. You can help us reach more queers in tech in need of support.
Until next time, I'm Nofel Teftauni.
And I'm Andy Saldana. Keep queering the tech ecosystem.